For those who don't know, I'm actually a pretty big football fan. I live in Kansas City, so the Chiefs games are absolutely a staple in my life every Sunday. I also grew up in St. Louis and was a huge Rams fan, like as big of a Rams fan as you could probably find. But after they left for LA, they were dead to me. But that's a story for another day. The reason I bring this up is while I wouldn't consider myself a expert in football by any means, I have noticed some similarities between the NFL and the NBA in terms of team building. And since I'm on vacation as of the release of this video, I thought this was a good time to talk about this since it really isn't something as time specific as, say, like the team previews were. So, what do I mean? Well, I just think there's a lot of parallels and lines that you can draw from what is traditionally successful team building in the NFL to what is traditionally successful team building in the NBA. And I think one of the most overlooked and most important markers for what makes a good team in the NFL is the offensive line. You don't necessarily have to have the best offensive line, but you do need to have competent play along the offensive line to be a good team in the NFL for the most part. If you look at the standings this year, the Commanders and the Bears are currently sitting at the bottom of the league in terms of sacks allowed, and neither of those teams are very good. Last year, it was the Bengals, followed by the Bears. The Bears obviously weren't very good. And the O line was absolutely what did the Bengals in during the Super Bowl. In 2020, the Eagles gave up the most sacks and were one of the worst teams in the league as a result. If you keep going back, you typically are going to see the teams that allow an insane amount of sacks are not very good. And it makes sense, right? If you don't have a good offensive line, your quarterback doesn't have time to make reads, the receivers have less time to get open, and you become really one dimensional because you also aren't able to run the ball. It isn't always flashy, but the offensive line is just super important. And for me, that's exactly the same as rim protection in the NBA. In the NBA, your rim protector isn't the most important role you have to fill, but you do have to find competent rim protection if your team has aspirations of making a title run. It's the biggest marker for whether or not you're going to be a good defensive team. And as I've mentioned several times on this podcast, the old saying that defense wins championships is absolutely true in the NBA. Since 1981, only three teams have won the championship without a defensive rating in the top 10. That'd be the 95 Rockets, the 2001 Lakers, and the 2018 Warriors. All three of those teams were in the midst of their title defense run, where in the prior year, they were top 10 in defensive rating. So pretty safe to say they were mailing it in for those title defense years, at least during the regular season. So while having a solid O line or a solid rim protector, it isn't always flashy. It's not usually something that's going to excite the fans, but you have to have competent play in those spots if you want to win a title in either the NFL or the NBA. And speaking of exciting the fans, no doubt in the NFL, no one excites the fans quite like the skill position guys, like the running backs or the wide receivers. And for me, this is just like a point guard or a small score first shooting guard in the NBA. They're great for making highlight plays that excite the fans, but it isn't always the best for winning. Sure, if you have one of those transcendent guys like a Devonte Adams or a Tyreek Hill in the NFL, or you have like a Steph Curry or a Trey Young in the NBA, it can absolutely help you win a lot of games. But where you get into trouble is when you pay like the next tier of skill position guys or small guards that big money, like they're one of those top tier guys. Guys like a Jalen Brunson, a De'Aaron Fox, or a Terry Rozier for the NBA, or in the NFL, someone like Kenny Galladay or Ezekiel Elliott. And the reality is, you just don't have to spend big money to get production at these spots. There's such an abundance of talent at those skill positions and at the guard spot in the NBA. Every year in the NFL, we see a whole slew of late round draft picks, guys who make a huge impact right away and value free agents. I mean, look at the Chiefs alone. They draft Isaiah Pacheco. He's been an awesome running back. They got him in the seventh round in this past year's draft. And then at receiver, we've got Marquez Valdez Scantling and Juju Smith Schuster, who have a combined cap hit of something like $8 million. Then on the NBA side, you've got guys like Jalen Brunson, Terry Rozier, and D'Lo. They're making somewhere between 20 and 30 million dollars a year to get you like 16 to 20 points a game. For the NBA this past offseason, you could have had Lonnie Walker, who's averaged like 12 points a game. I think it's going to be more this year on the Lakers. You could have had him for $6 million a year. Goran Dragic, he's on a minimum contract. Tyus Jones, who's really solid, signed for like 15 million. Even someone like Gary Payton II only ended up signing something like an $8 million a year contract. If you go back a little bit further, Kendrick Nunn was a 15 a game scorer for Miami, and he only went for like 5 million a year. Granted, we haven't really seen him play much since he was in Miami, so maybe that's not the best example. And sure, on the NBA side, guys like Jalen Brunson and Terry Rozier, they're better players than the guys I just mentioned, but that marginal increase in production isn't worth the price tag, especially when it comes at the cost of rounding out the rest of your roster. Same thing is true in the NFL. Unless you're getting one of those top tier skill position guys, there are viable options for far cheaper. Outside of that, how many Super Bowl caliber NFL teams are built around a skill position player being the most important and most expensive guy on the team? Look at the Titans the past few years with Derrick Henry, or look at the Panthers who just gave up on the Christian McCaffrey thing. In the NBA, I know Trae Young is still pretty early into his career, but his slight frame has already started to become an issue come playoff time. Chris Paul has only made the finals once in his career, and for as good as Dame has been throughout his career, he's never been to the finals. In the NBA, I can really only think of two champions that were unquestionably led by a smaller guard. That would be the Warriors with Steph Curry and the Bad Boy Pistons with Isaiah Thomas. Maybe the 79 Sonics, but I don't really know a lot about them, if I'm being honest. And I could probably argue that Jack Sikma was the most important guy on that team. My whole point is here, if you have to skimp and cut corners at a spot on either an NFL team or an NBA team, the skill position guys and the smaller guards is the place that you want to do it. It's hard to build a title level team around these guys, and it's the easiest place where you can find good value and good production for cheap due to the depth of skill at these positions. So in the NFL, obviously players only play one side of the ball versus the two sides of the ball that they have to play in the NBA. But I still think there are some comparisons that you can make between NBA defense and NFL defense. If you compare the defensive backfield and like the secondary to a perimeter defense in basketball, and the defensive line or interior guys in the NFL to your rim protection and your big guys in the NBA. Obviously, it would be ideal to have both an elite interior and perimeter defense in the NBA, just like it would be great if you had a really stellar defensive line and a really awesome secondary. But you don't need both of those positional groups to be elite to be a good defensive team in either league. In basketball, if one of either your perimeter defense or your interior defense, or in the case of the NFL, you have either an elite front seven or an elite secondary, and the other is at least serviceable, you're still going to have a really good defense. But make no mistake about it, both of those facets in both the NFL and the NBA have to at least be solid. In football, in the passing game, if you have a huge void in the way of your front seven, receivers are eventually going to get open no matter how good your cornerbacks are. Receivers are just too good in the NFL. So if the quarterback has all day to throw, I don't care how good your secondary is, you're going to get carved up. Then in the running game, if the offensive line is just bowling over that defensive front and they're able to get to the second level, forget about it. The running game is just going to gash your defense, no matter if you have really good safeties that are able to help and run support. The inverse is also true in the running game. If the runner is able to get past your front line, you need your secondary to be able to step up and make a play. Otherwise, it's going to be a huge run play after play. And then obviously passing game wise, your pass rush needs at least a few seconds to get to the quarterback. If the receivers are just immediately getting open, I don't care who you have on that defensive line, you're going to get, again, carved up. The same is true for the NBA. If one of either your interior or perimeter defense is elite and the other is at least solid, you're going to have a really good defensive team. Think about a team like the Bulls in the 90s. They had two just all-time perimeter defenders in Scottie Pippen and Michael Jordan. And while guys like Luke Longley or Bill Cartwright were solid defensively, they were nowhere near elite like a guy like Mutombo or Olajuwon were. But even with that said, even with just solid play at that rim protection slot, they were still consistently one of the best defensive teams in the league during that run. On the other hand, we saw with the Jazz firsthand the prior season, even with a generational rim protector in Rudy Gobert, the Jazz were just a middle of the road defensive team. And it completely unraveled for them in the playoffs because The perimeter defenders were just giving free lanes to the rim. So yeah, it's hard to survive in the NFL or in the NBA defensively if one aspect of your defense is severely lacking. The last spot I want to talk about is the quarterback position, and there just isn't a one-to-one positional comparison to the NBA. We've seen throughout the history of the league, a championship caliber team can be built around a player of basically any position, whereas in the NFL, the quarterback is unquestionably and always the most important position on the field. However, I still do feel like there's a good comparison between the NBA and the quarterback for the NFL, and that's the NBA's star player, or more specifically, the max contract guys. From a contract perspective in the NFL, outside of having a guy on a rookie contract, you're going to have to spend an absurd portion of your salary cap on the quarterback position. And it almost doesn't matter who your quarterback is, the price tag is relatively the same. The most expensive quarterbacks are pretty much always the guys who just most recently signed a contract extension. And the same is true for the NBA. The most expensive players in the league are the ones who just most recently signed a contract extension. Every offseason, we see new records being set for most lucrative contracts in the NBA and the NFL. Sure, guys like Kirk Cousins, Derek Carr, and Ryan Tannehill are making less than Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen, but it isn't significantly less, and it certainly isn't enough to make up for the talent disparity there. Despite what the price tag says, not all quarterbacks are created equally, just like not all max contract guys are created equally in the NBA. Sure, the Supermax has created some disparity between a generational player in the league and just a star player, but you've still got weird situations where guys like Tobias Harris and Jimmy Butler are making essentially the same amount of money, or Devin Booker and Kristaps Porzingis, or Donovan Mitchell and De'Aaron Fox. Between the sets of players I just mentioned, there's huge talent gaps between all of them, even though the salary figures are relatively the same. Just like the talent gap between Dak Prescott and Josh Allen, or Patrick Mahomes and Derek Carr is pretty huge, despite the salary figures being pretty close. And in the NFL, you might not feel great about giving a guy like Kirk Cousins or Ryan Tannehill a huge contract, but if you want an average to above average quarterback, that's just the price of doing business. Just like in the NBA, if you want a quality number 2 or number 3 option, a top 50-ish guy in the league, it's going to take a max contract. It doesn't feel good to give De'Aaron Fox or Tobias Harris a max contract, but that's just the price of doing business in the league. And yeah, absolutely, you could get into a lot of trouble in the NBA or the NFL if you're spending too much money at the quarterback position or on a quote star player. In the NBA, we've seen time and time again, if you go all in on a big three made up of 3 max contract guys, your depth sucks. We saw it last year with the Nets and Lakers, and in prior seasons with the Kobe Dwight Lakers or the big 3 Heat. The rest of those rosters were just kind of mad. You were just forced to scrounge up whatever you could find in terms of aging vets or unproven, unwanted young players to fill out the roster. Look at the Lakers both this year and last year, because they're spending so much on Russell Westbrook, Anthony Davis, and LeBron James. They're forced to round out the roster with a washed up Carmelo Anthony or Dwight Howard, DeAndre Jordan. And then this year with guys like Dennis Schroeder, Thomas Bryant, who's always hurt, and then Juan Toscano Anderson. Some of those guys are decent enough players, sure, but if you're asking them to be key rotational guys or, God forbid, a starter, that's where you start to get into trouble. The same thing happens in the NFL when you've got Aaron Rodgers signing a mega contract that eventually cost them Davante Adams. And now their receiving core is really suspect, and this team is struggling as a result. Same thing with the Chiefs. They lose Tyreek Hill because of the Mahomes contract, and they were forced to kind of assemble a receiving core on the fly. Granted, it's working out better for them than it is for the Packers. Ideally, when you spend big money at a quarterback spot, they're going to be able to cover up a lot of the blemishes with their elite play, sort of like Brady did in the past with the Pats all those years with kind of a revolving door at wide receiver, or like how Mahomes can put up a ton of points offensively to make up for a pretty below average defense. You hope that your star players in the NBA could do the same thing for your franchise, like LeBron did with the Cavs and the Heat, getting the most out of guys like Mario Chalmers, Old Ray Allen, or J.R. Smith. But where you get into trouble is when you pay a guy like Kirk Cousins or Dak Prescott that big money and they can't cover up for those blemishes. Or when you pay a guy like Julius Randle a big contract and he can't elevate the team. that's when you get into trouble and you end up with one of those middle of the road franchises. Not bad enough to get a top pick, but not good enough to make any real noise come postseason time. The other angle I want to briefly discuss about this is the rookie contract situation. In the NFL, if you draft a stud quarterback who's good right away, it gives you tons of freedom to add other top tier players at other positions. Like the Bengals with Joe Burrow, they were able to beef up their offensive line this offseason. The Dolphins were able to grab Tyreek Hill because Tua makes so little. The same thing happens in the NBA. Look at last year with the Pelicans grabbing CJ McCollum because that Zion extension hadn't kicked in, or this past offseason where the Cavs were able to pick up Donovan Mitchell because Evan Mobley's contract extension hasn't kicked in yet. Sure, the NBA cap works a lot differently than the NFL. It allows for more flexibility, but you still see teams with young stars in the NBA make big splashes that they wouldn't normally be able to make if they were paying market value for their young star versus a guy just on a rookie contract. Just like the NFL, if a quarterback is ahead of schedule developmentally, you could be more aggressive in free agency to put a really good team around them. But what do you guys think? Am I completely crazy here? Is there anything that I missed? Let me know down in the comments section. I'm hoping to keep this as an open discussion.